and welcome back to the Lady Gardeners podcast. It's episode 2 and this week I have an extra special guest for you all. This is someone who has really inspired me in my journey and taught me an awful lot through her book Wildling. Isabella Tree is a conservationist and author and has been doing a project at a place called Knepp Farm for just over 20 years now. And the book is amazing. It's a real inspirational story that really fills you with hope that we can save our environment and that there's lots that we can do. She's even written another book called The Book of Wildling, which introduces you to projects that you can do in your own garden, no matter how big or small your space. So I'll leave the gritty details for the interview itself, but I have listened to her book Wildling as an audiobook. I've read it as a physical book, and it is definitely a title that makes my book list of books that have changed your life. So I really hope you're going to enjoy it as much as I enjoyed interviewing Isabella. And our sponsor, Feverfew Gardening, also was over the moon when she heard that I had Isabella as a guest. So Rachel, I hope that it doesn't disappoint. Now on to our sponsor. A huge thank you to Feverfew Gardening Co, our podcast sponsors, who make the most amazing gloves for women. They fit like a glove. They're super durable. I was ripping brambles and nettles out of the garden all weekend and they saved my hands. I've even just bought the new limited edition pair with Chloe Plumstead because they are just stunning. They've got a little mushroom on, they're a beautiful colour. So that completes my collection. Now, Rachel has given you the opportunity to get your hands on a pair for yourself with a little discount code of 15% off with code LadyGardener15. So happy shopping, happy listening, and happy growing.
Very good, thanks, very good.
Thank you so much for making the time to chat with me today. I mentioned just as we started, your book Wildling was a book that really inspired me in my own kind of gardening journey, and I think opened my eyes to a lot of issues within agricultural communities. So I'm really excited to kind of hear more about your story, and you tell it in such a beautiful way in the book, but it'll be nice to hear kind of a slightly different version. So thank you.
Pleasure.
To get started, I would love to hear from you kind of where your adventure started, what your career was like before the book Wildling, and how you came to write the book about the project.
Well, I mean, I suppose, I mean, I'm not a scientist. You know, my since rewilding, I've kind of, you know, moved much more into this world of ecology and conservation. But I was trained as a classicist, so Latin and ancient Greek, and I became a journalist and really a sort of travel correspondent for a long time. But I was also writing books, and the first book I wrote when I was about 24 was a book about an ornithologist, a Victorian ornithologist called John Gould, who was a colleague of Darwin's. And so I've always been interested in natural history, I suppose. And I kind of grew up in Dorset. I had a very feral childhood. I'm of a generation which was, you know, if you grew up in the countryside, you invariably had a feral childhood. You know, you were allowed to sort of wander for hours outdoors and cycle for miles and no one asked questions. And it was a, you know, much freer, I think, place to live in those days, 60 or 50, 60 years ago. So I suppose nature has always been very much part of my life. And when I travelled around the world, writing for newspapers for the Evening Standard and the Sunday Times and Geographical Magazine and others, I was always very interested in natural history and wildlife and conservation. So it was very much a theme. And the book before Wildling was about a living goddess in Kathmandu, and it took me an inordinately long time to write that book. It took me about 14 years to write the book. I thought it was going to take 2. But in the end, it was actually a very good thing, because if I had written Wildling any earlier than I did, it came out in 2018. And if I'd published it perhaps, you know, in 2010 or even a few years later, I don't think it would have hit the zeitgeist. I think it was all very much a question of timing rewilding success, because 10 years earlier, I don't think people would have been interested in rewilding or even been familiar with the word. Or suddenly in 2018, we had a kind of awakening of consciousness, I think, about the plight of the planet. I think maybe there'd been bubblings of eco-anxiety amongst the general population for some time, but it was only sort of in 2018 with Extinction Rebellion and Greta Thunberg and David Attenborough then coming out and saying, look, there is a problem, and actually tacking on, population crises and environmental crises onto his nature films. And then we had the plastics revolution. It all seemed to kick off around about 2018. And so publishing this book about the story of how we had recovered nature on our plot of land, on our estate of 3,500 acres in Sussex, was a kind of story of hope that really magnetized the attention, I think, of people who were looking for, a good news story or a sense of optimism, or how do we address this a problem of this magnitude that's affecting the whole planet. And there we were, having done 20 years nearly of this rewilding project and showing what miracles can happen.
And it's such a fantastic project, and like you say, it's that, for me, it was definitely a sign of hope. Although there are some chapters where you really feel your heart sink when things are going wrong, or when one solution has created another issue. But I think it also shows that kind of bravery and courage that to keep on going with things. And I think it's a really good lesson for life, actually, whether you're a gardener or just going through your own journey. In the garden and in natural landscapes, things don't just go down a really simple path of going the way you expect them to and seeing success after success after success. It kind of takes you on a bit of a roller coaster. So I completely agree. It was just hit the nail on the head at the exact right time. And I'm sure that you've seen fantastic success since, because the whole kind of landscape and attitude towards environmental causes has really changed, and people who would have never blinked twice at the thought of anything environmental happening 10 years ago are now starting to kind of understand a little bit more why the problems are problems, and not just kind of brush it off as someone who's decided to write an article about something that might be a problem but probably isn't.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
I mean, yes, I agree. I think there is a sort of sea change, and I think that's a kind of awareness that we can't leave everything to the politicians. We can't just expect governments to solve things. We are, all of us, uniquely responsible for what's happening to the planet, whether we like it or not. And we are culpable, but equally we have the power to make change ourselves. And only if every single individual does their bit can we turn this Titanic around. But also there is enormous joy and satisfaction and kind of a sense of achievement, I suppose, and excitement about being able to put nature back in the driving seat. And I think you're right when you say, we need to be patient and to not expect things to go our own way all the time. And I think that's a very important lesson that nature has taught us at Knepp, is that often we approach nature, whether it's in our garden or a window box or a farm, very much as if we are in the driving seat, we are in control, we have goals and targets we want to meet. And nature, we're trying to put nature into a box. We're trying to contain nature. And that really has been the whole problem with what's happening on the planet today. And, you can take it into, a very small context, into a sort of microcosm. And if you're in your garden and you're saying, I love such and such a type of rose, that's what I'm going to grow in my garden, come what may. And it fails again and again, and you take it out and replace it and put another of the same species in. really your garden is trying to tell you something. That's not what it wants to grow. The conditions aren't right there for it. So, I think what we need to adopt, whatever we're doing when we have fingers in the soil or our feet on the soil, is to accept some humility. And that's where, it's a connected word, human, humility, and humus, the soil is all connected. We need to listen to nature much, much more than we have been doing.
That's such an interesting point you make, because a lot of people think they're bad gardeners or think they can't grow anything. And actually, I was just in a meeting yesterday where a lot of people were talking about plants they bought from the garden centre, and they always buy the same plants and they die within a couple of weeks. And they were like, what's wrong? And I was like, well, without knowing more about the situation, I can't give you a point blank answer. But for one, the plants in the garden centres are destined to be on the best show possible when you buy them. So for a lot of those plants, that means it's only downhill from the moment you buy them. And if they're not if they're annual plants, they are going to come to the end of their season and die naturally through no fault of your own. That is the natural cycle. And then also they've bought plants, perhaps plants that are going to thrive in the shade, and have put them in full sun, and they've just left them in a pot with they've not watered them enough, or they don't have enough nutrients. There's no kind of biodiversity in the soil, and so inevitably those plants aren't going to succeed as well as they would if they were in a natural place. But I think it's something that people who aren't invested in the kind of gardening world, they don't know anything about, and then they just have that real negative view on, I can't grow anything, I'm a rubbish gardener, when, like you said, it's nature doing nature's thing, and those plants aren't designed to thrive in the environment you've put them in. So no, then they're never going to succeed. It doesn't matter if you buy them 10 years in a row, they're never going to have adapted to that different climate.
Exactly. But I think we should also question, why are we having to care so much for a plant? You were talking about watering and fertilizer and compost and all that sort of thing. We really have to rethink the way we are gardening. We can't. The water is a scarcity now in Britain as well as anywhere else. In Sussex, we've been draining our water table underneath the downs for decades now, and we now have a water nutrient, sort of scarcity problem where we are, and we have apparently less water per capita than people in Morocco. We cannot be designing gardens now where you're turning the hose on and watering. Our gardens should be resilient enough not to be watered and not to have inputs. We should be thinking in a totally different way. I think agriculture has really influenced the way we look at gardens. We have a mindset now to think that, our gardens are successful only if they have very, very leafy, very productive plants. But actually, when you look at the plants that are good for biodiversity, that are good for insects and pollinators and natural pest control and the rest, often they're the kind of wildflowers that live on very, very poor soil. That's what most of our native wildflowers in the UK have evolved to, the conditions they've evolved to live with. So we actually need to impoverish our gardens if we're going to garden for nature. I'm not talking about vegetable patches or your allotment here. Obviously, you're going to need very fertile soils to produce food. But, when we're talking about gardening for nature, which I think can be really exciting and productive in terms of what we're giving back to the planet, we need to think very differently about what our gardens can look like and what we're putting into them.
And so this actually really nicely segues into your most recent book, which I was going to say for later, but I feel like this is the perfect time to talk about it, because there is a lot of information out there on what you can do to make your gardens more wildlife friendly. But I think it tends to only look at a very siloed tunnel vision point of view, and is also highly driven by the aesthetic vision of the garden, being wildlife friendly and looking how you want it to look at the same time. So could you possibly tell us a little bit more about your latest book and what that's designed to do?
Yes, I mean, here is a sort of shameless plug. I've actually got the book here. It's called the Book of Wilding. It's a practical guide to rewilding big and small. I originally envisaged it as a kind of handbook that you could put in your pocket, but now it's so big you could kill yourself if you fall asleep reading it in bed. But it's really applying the principles of rewilding. It's what we've learned in the wider landscape here at Knepp, and applying them to smaller spaces. And it was really triggered by so many requests from people who'd visited Knepp, who had seen the kind of abundance of wildlife that has poured back in since we've given up farming, and since we've sort of started a project using free roaming animals to kind of stimulate the sort of revival of ecosystems. And asking, we don't have thousands of acres, we don't have hundreds of acres. I've got an allotment or an orchard or a backyard or a window box, or I tend my local churchyard. What can I do to rewild these spaces? And so this is really what the book is about. It kind of it places rewilding on a spectrum. Often academics and journalists are very kind of obsessed with the definition of rewilding. They're always wanting to kind of put it in a box, and that's what I love about the word, is it really can't be defined. It's constantly reinventing itself. And so the way we envisage rewilding really is on a spectrum. And at the wildest end of it, you've got the kind of wilderness areas like Yellowstone National Park, Alaska, the Serengeti, Chernobyl exclusion zone, places which are truly wild, where you've got apex predators, you've got the whole system of nature functioning without the need of human intervention. And then you get, smaller areas of nature reserves, and you get areas like Knepp, 3,500 acres, where you start having to do a few initial interventions to start kickstarting natural processes again. And one of those is restoring natural water systems. That's a kind of, where you restore your floodplains. You have dynamic rivers again, where you get ephemeral ponds that flood and dry out in the summer. All those natural hydrology actually are a kind of one-off intervention that then continue to be dynamic, pretty much ad infinitum. So you just have to go in there, restore these processes, and sit back and let nature do its thing. But also at Knepp, we've introduced free roaming animals, and they're really key to restoring the kind of life cycle through the soil, through vegetation. Their dung helps restore the soil. The microbes and the bacteria in their gut actually start triggering bacteria and microbes in the soil. But also the way they trample and rootle, in the case of our pigs, and the way they browse vegetation, and just the general disturbances they make. If they're bulls and they roll and create bull pits, everything they do opens up niches for other life. And so they're a missing part of the jigsaw that we've kind of forgotten about in nature restoration. But obviously, when you get smaller and smaller, you get to areas of, say, 50 acres or so, just a couple of fields, or, you've got an orchard or a garden. You can't have herds of free-roaming animals. I mean, you might be adventurous and kind of put them in for kind of like, a week and take them out again. But that's a really complicated process. But in those smaller areas, it's up to human beings to become the keystone species and to start mimicking those natural processes. So you, as the gardener or as the smallholder, have to become the bison. So the bison in nature will ring bark trees and actually kill trees. So you will want to do that in your garden. If you just it's not a question of closing the garden gate and just letting nature take over. Lots of people tell me, oh, I'm rewilding my garden, which means not doing anything. It's not like that at all. Rewilding a smaller space needs enormous amount of interventions, but it's really about thinking about natural processes that happen in the wider landscape and how can I apply them to that small space. So if you just let your garden go without touching it, it would pretty soon become colonized by trees. They would shade out all the plants underneath, and biodiversity would start crashing. The diversity of your plants would disappear, and the sunlit areas would go, and and most creatures need sunlight at some stage of their life cycle to proliferate. So turning things into kind of closed canopy trees is not the answer. So you become the bison. So you will either browse out any saplings that pop up in your garden, or you'll actually decide to get rid of a tree. So you'll be thinking like a kind of bison. But if you're putting in a pond, and that's a very nature friendly thing to do, it's obviously wonderful, but we still, as you say, we think in terms of a very aesthetic managed garden. And so most people would put in a pond, it would be round, probably, it would probably be the same depth throughout. It might have lawn running up to the sides of it. It'll be very kind of uniform. It will still stimulate a little bit of life there. But if you want to rewild, and you're thinking with that rewilding mindset, you'd think like a beaver. You'd go in and you'd create a pond that has different levels of water, that you'd put in some dead wood to break down and start feeding the aquatic insects that will eventually feed the small fry, the fish that will come in, perhaps on the feet of ducks or whatever is attracted into that pond. You will paddle around the edges like a water buffalo. We used to have a European water buffalo in Europe until we hunted them out. And that will create little puddles and ponds where aquatic plants can take off, where you can have spawning grounds for your newts and your toads and your frogs. So it's about letting some dynamism into your space, while at the same time, you know, accepting your kind of limits of change. You may want to have an area where you sit out and you have a bit of lawn. But, you know, could it be a wildflower lawn? Could it be a chamomile lawn? Lovely to crush that scent underneath your feet. It doesn't have to be a monoculture grass lawn. Could you allow that lawn to grow up so that it can, you have your no-mow May and you have your let it bloom June? Could you actually go through until August or early September before you get rid of that long grass? Could you have different layers of grass in your garden so that you have vegetation structure, some cover for small mammals, and some different habitat for your insect species? We should question too, I think, how often we go to the garden centre. You know, garden centres, you know, they're $1 billion businesses, and you know, I go to, you know, if I stop in at mine, I'm horrified by what it's selling. It's, you know, it's a depot selling weapons of mass destruction. It is not a nature friendly place. And yet what we are being sold often are things that we're told, you know, as a nature friendly gardener we should buy. Why are we buying bird boxes, for example? Why isn't there habitat in our garden, you know, a lovely sort of thorny bush, or you know, a rich hedge of native shrubs? Or why have we not got climbers growing up a building, ivy growing over a shed, or up a tree where birds can nest in naturally? Much better for them. It's got a much better microclimate. They're much less likely to get disease. They're much less likely to be predated on by a woodpecker or something else coming in to attack that nesting box. So, you know, we should always question why we are being enticed to buy something for our garden that nature couldn't provide itself.
That's so interesting to listen to you talk about that, because actually there's quite a lot of things here that I've actually not considered. For example, bird boxes, and kind of where we created a man-made need for us to buy bird boxes to be able to provide for the wildlife. But from listening to you speak, it really feels like a really creative way of gardening, and actually a chance to kind of let your creativity go more wild, but with a rationale behind it, rather than just simply doing things for the sake of creating a beautiful structure or planting something that is for the wildlife. It's really kind of connecting the pieces of the puzzle together to create a space that works for you and for nature. And it sounds really exciting. Like, I've got a garden right in the place that I'm sat now, which is, it needs a lot of work done to it. It's obviously been abandoned for a very long time, and some of the paths are very odd. Like, some of the paths are 20-30 centimetres wide at some points, and then they go to like 1.5 meters with bits of gravel. And actually it's making me really excited to think about how we can implement those types of things into our own garden and have that wild and whimsical feel, but with it really benefiting nature, as opposed to the alternative where we're just kind of monoculturing certain areas so that it fits a narrative.
Yeah, totally. And I think also one of the dangers often, I think, is you know, we move house so often as a nation. I think there's some reports that actually people move between 2 and 5 years. Every 2 to 5 years they move on. And if that means you're taking on a new garden, quite often, a new owner will want to stamp their mark on a new garden, which means basically starting from scratch again. You go back to ground zero, and you're removing any habitat that had been evolving in that space. If there are old garden walls or a wonky wooden gate, that's removed. But actually, those bits of infrastructure over time can start providing wonderful bug hotels. So we would always advise people who are kind of going to reconstruct an old garden wall to be really, really careful, and perhaps do it in increments. Only rebuild that bit that really needs rebuilding, but keep all that old brickwork, the crumbling mortar if you can, because that's where all your insects will have found a home. Do you really have to replace that wonky garden gate, or could you just stabilize it? Put in an extra post, put in whatever it is to make it function again, but not go right out from scratch and build a new one. And so it's really just thinking in terms. You've got to think like a beetle or a solitary bee, or a sort of think about an ear. Where would an earwig live? What is there already in this overgrown, neglected garden that actually is incredibly valuable? How can I tread lightly and create the spaces that I want and that I enjoy and I find beautiful, but not to be in a huge rush to transform all in one go. Perhaps live with it for a bit until you feel comfortable and think, well, actually, that patch of brambles and nettles in the corner is humming with butterflies. Maybe I'll leave it. I can live with it. Or perhaps I could clear that little bit here, but to see how it feels. We're always so trigger happy, I think, with our machinery. Dare I say it, particularly men, longing to use the sort of the all the sort of machines that can help us clear and mow and leaf blow, and so I think, again, like going to the garden centre, we should question every time we touch especially a sort of petrol or diesel fueled implement. Why am I doing that?
That's really interesting. I was going to say it's something that surprised me in my kind of adventures, is how quickly the wildlife can return to a space that seemed kind of void. I say void, the example.
Yep.
So the space that I have been recently working on is we took on an old calf linny on a piece of National Trust land that was part of a farm that's been in use for 400 years. And the farmer died a couple of years ago, and so the National Trust took it back under their management and are using a lot of those spaces for community use. So we have a small not-for-profit where we run workshops for children and adults, kind of teaching them how to grow their own vegetables, flowers, and really just encouraging people to spend time outside, whether they simply come and sit and have a cup of tea and watch the bees buzz around the nasturtiums, or whether they really want to get stuck in hands-on and build planters and sow seeds, grow plants. But the space when we took it on was just a concrete courtyard with a kind of barn building, and there was a few weeds there, but it looked like a really sparse area in terms of you couldn't see many insects crawling around. And one of my big concerns was, we're going to put gardening beds on here, and how is the biodiversity going to find its way into the beds? And with no kind of interaction from us, those beds are absolutely teeming with wildlife. And we've taken a couple of buckets of compost from the National Trust property, because they've got very biodiverse compost bays, And very quickly we've kind of filled this space, and you can see the bees and the butterflies, and when you dig into the soil there's so many amazing insects that the kids love to kind of watch doing their thing. And I think that I always expected it would take years and years for that kind of diversity to return to a space, but it's actually, although you need to practice patience, you do start seeing those rewards more quickly than I would have anticipated. Is that something you found with your spaces as well?
Absolutely. It's certainly what we found, in the wider landscape. I mean, in a matter of 20 years, we've gone from being a very depleted, chemical soaked, post-industrial farm to being one of the most, biodiverse hotspots in Britain, including, some of the rarest species we have, like turtle doves and nightingales and purple emperor butterflies. A couple of years ago, the large tortoiseshell butterfly was found here breeding, and that is a species that was thought to have been extinct in Britain for 50 years. So miracles happen all the time. And you're right, nature bounces back if we let it. But I think we also, overlook, again, it's this idea that we need to be making our gardens fertile in order for them to be biodiverse. And I think it's a very difficult mindset to change that. We've tried to prove the point in our walled garden here at Knepp. Charlie, my husband, and I were sitting on our kind of lawn, which we had finally let grow during lockdown. And we sort of thought, my God, we've been thinking for 20 years about the wider landscape, and we haven't thought about our own garden. And it was we thought nature friendly. It hadn't we'd always been organic. We'd never used pesticides in it. We grew vegetables and had flowers, but it was a very conventional garden. Weeds were weeded out. Our native wildflowers were zero tolerance, and it was very sort of lawn heavy, I suppose. And in the middle of it was a big croquet lawn, which obviously is kind of, it's a biological desert when you're talking and thinking in terms of wildlife. And so we asked the wonderful garden designer, who's a friend of ours, Tom Stewart Smith, and James Hitchmo, who works out of Sheffield University, who's brilliant plantsman and specialises in brownfield sites in cities, and also wildflower meadows. What we could do to make our garden really, really nature friendly. How could we make it as biodiverse as possible and raise those levels of biodiversity as much as we possibly could? And so James came up with this sort of ingenious idea. We were at the time renovating a barn on the estate to become our restaurant, the Wilding Kitchen and Shop. And there was an enormous amount of post-industrial farm concrete and brick available, and from that site. So James got that brick and concrete crushed, and we dumped 400 tons of it onto our croquet lawn. So instantly, we've sculpted it into mounds and troughs. And, instantly, we think in terms of 2D often in our gardens. Gardens are kind of flat, but you can increase your surface area and therefore the amount of plants you can have, and the interest, by turning it into a 3D landscape, having lumps and bumps and hollows. They don't have to be very tall. These in our garden, which is a relatively big garden, but are only about a metre or a metre and a half high, the ridges, and then they go down probably a metre. But instantly that creates different microclimates within that garden. So you've got slopes on a north-facing side that will provide conditions for a certain type of plant community, and the sunny side on the south will encourage completely different plants. But equally, we've got different pH values. So we've got dressings of sand in some areas, a light dressing of soil somewhere else, but generally very, very poor nutrient conditions. And that is just rocket fuel for those tiny, wonderful little flowers, the sort of alpine kind of species, the xeric desert kind of plants that insects absolutely love. And we did a baseline survey of insects when we had our previous garden, the sort of nature-friendly normal garden, if you like. Um, and in 2.5 years, the insect species have increased 33%.
Oh, wow.
And we now have a host of nationally rare insects that have found this garden because of the interesting mosaic of habitats that's in there. And we've got to remember that insects are very, very complicated creatures. Most of them have really intricate life cycles where they demand different habitats and different plants for different parts of that life cycle. So having a kind of monoculture is going to, be appreciated by very, very few species. As soon as you can start mixing it up and getting a really dynamic kind of kaleidoscope going, that's when you'll find all these surprising insects coming in.
Oh, it's given me so many ideas already on what we can do in both of our garden spaces. And again,
love your concrete.
Love the concrete, and also the mounds. I'd never really considered we have things like a herb spiral built out of old bricks I have it at my allotment, and we've got it facing a certain way so that you've got the shady elements for certain herbs and the sunny elements for others, but I've never really considered that in any other way.
It'll be doing wonderful things for insects too. Exactly. And you could do that kind of thing anywhere in a garden. So, we just had a wonderful gardener, Peter Corn, who came looking around the garden with us, with Tom. There's always sort of other things you can do, but he was sort of saying, that actually sandy banks, of say 10 to 15 centimeters, just that kind of incline, or a little brick wall, that's what insects love. They love that little bit of height. So having, thinking of the topography of your garden is really interesting. And the smaller your space, you can build a bigger space just by using topography in an intelligent kind of way. And you think about just even a small wall, how the wind blow, and the sort of the warmth and the sort of the calm sheltered spots, all that little bit of ridge, that wall is instantly creating little microclimates around it. So it's having funky, funny little bits of old infrastructure is also really useful.
I'm really excited to go away and kind of look at the design. We haven't moved any further with doing anything with the garden yet because we're focusing on the inside, but I feel like after this it's definitely going to make me want to revisit all of those plans and work out how we can implement and make things a bit more interesting and unique, because when you're looking at garden ideas online, they are all very much a kind of standard shape, size, flat beds. It's just very sort of regimented, and they still look beautiful, but I love this idea of kind of having a bit more excitement in all shapes and textures and topography.
Well, you should come on one of our gardening tours. Come on a Rewild Your Garden tour. Our wonderful head gardener, Charlie Harper, who studied under Tom Stewart Smith, is now sort of, the rewilding gardener supremo. He's the guy who really knows the plants. And our wonderful deputy head gardeners, Moy and Susie, are just brilliant. And they're kind of creating this way of thinking about a garden in a totally different way. They've created a thing called the grazing index, which is a really new idea that we're hoping to kind of carry forward, that will influence people as to how they look at so-called weeds. I mean, I'm trying never to use that word again, but our native wildflowers. So obviously the seed rain comes into the walled garden the whole time. And you're getting things like fumitories, scarlet pimpernel, clover, all sorts of things, docks, thistles, whatever, taking off. And so the grazing index is really how you go around the garden thinking like a browsing animal. And so obviously you don't want one of those plants to come in and start being a thug and taking out all the other species. You're wanting, as the keystone species, you're wanting to keep the diversity of plants as rich as possible. So if you see a plant taking over and being a thug, you go in and kind of pull it out, thinking of yourself like that browsing pony or a browsing aurochs or something. But equally, when you see a dandelion or when you see daisies or whatever coming into your garden, what is their value for wildlife? How can I rate them on value for wildlife versus annoyance because they're so difficult to get rid of? And so you can do this grazing index, which is actually saying this plant is absolutely fantastic for insects. It's amazing for pollinating insects. It may be ragwort, incredible for insects. And actually ragwort very, very easy to pull out, get rid of. So that would probably have quite a high rating, but something that's much lower on the kind of beneficial spectrum for insects or other life, and perhaps harder to get rid of, would have a much lower score. And so it's just beginning to think in terms of, before I just have a knee-jerk reaction because I consider that to be a weed, is it actually really doing a good job here? Is that dock with its very, very deep root actually helping to get rid of some compaction in that rather tricky corner of the garden? Is it doing me a favour? So it's a really interesting way of again looking at our native wildflowers and how they can play a part in the garden too. But on these, on these tours that we have, it's very interesting to see people's reaction, because often people come with a very, very fixed mindset and they're kind of almost like, rewilding isn't for me. And then they see it and they think, my God, that's rather incredible. And maybe they won't go the whole way, but it just walking around it and feeling that life, I think, begins to change the sort of mindset, in a way that just talking about it or reading about it can't. You have to feel it, don't you? You have to feel those wild spaces or those gardens that are really alive, to feel this is what I want. This is what makes me feel good. And so it's the experience that I think is really important when we think about trying to change the cultural perceptions that we've grown up with, and often those sensibilities that are so tied to a sense of nostalgia, because we've grown up with something, we're familiar with it, we feel comfortable, we feel attached to it, and that may not be the kind of place that's actually good for the planet, good for wildlife. And so kind of divorcing ourselves from that, stepping back a bit and changing our aesthetic is a really, really difficult thing to do. And I think you can only do that by actually visiting other places. Thinking of, places that have real spirit of place, somewhere like Derek Jarman's garden, where, on the sort of Suffolk coast, or somewhere which is really difficult to grow plants, and where gardeners have actually managed to achieve wonderful things by using the plants that you can only use the plants that will grow there. And it has a fantastic spirit of place, but also is inevitably wonderful for wildlife, because it's what that habitat is suited for.
I couldn't agree more on the having to experience things to really feel that, and I think have that overall understanding. We have it a lot in terms of when people come to visit our space, you cannot capture anything in a photo that really emphasizes what that place feels like to be there. And I think that an experience that brings it home for me is when I was 19, I went to university in Aberdeen, in the Granite City, where there is barely any greenery. It's a lot of grey buildings, the sun barely rises. It's probably the worst place I've ever lived in my life. But having come from the North Devon coast and having lived with greenery all around and the beaches and just sheer natural beauty everywhere, I had never once appreciated it until I went away to uni, where there wasn't any. There is a beach, but there's no beautiful green spaces, and there's not trees everywhere you turn, and you don't walk past big lush green parks. And when I came home, I had that real appreciation for the natural environment around me. And then again, when you go to other gardens that are teeming with wildlife and have so much diversity and interest there, you compare it to another space and you're like, there's so much more atmosphere and excitement, and your eyes are just drawn all around the space. So I think from reading the book Wilding, Knepp seems like the most incredible place to me, but I can totally imagine how seeing it and walking around it and really being able to engage with it as a place would be a whole other level of experience. So I'm definitely coming for a tour before the end of the year. When do they finish?
You must come for a safari in the wider landscape, and then come to the garden and see how those ideas translate into that space. But yes, it's absolutely right. I think, we're talking now, aren't we, about having a GCSE in natural history, which I think is a wonderful thing to be offering the next generation. But I don't think you can ever really learn attachment to nature through a classroom.
No.
It's got to be experience, and it's through the heart, not the head. That's where the changes happen, and that's where the attachment develops. And that's why the things you do is so wonderful. Getting children into nature, and just even beginning to feel at ease with insects. We demonize them. We're so frightened of them. We hate wasps. We hate mosquitoes. We hate hornets. All these earwigs, all these incredible creatures that do wonderful, wonderful things for us. And so, getting people to feel comfortable sitting out in a patch of land that is just buzzing with those creatures is amazing. But it is absolutely about that sense of biophilia. E.O. Wilson, the great American biologist, coined the phrase, this attachment, this love of living things that I think everybody has deep down, and particularly children are open to it because they haven't had quite so much prejudice thrown at them from the sort of, the pesticide, Dettol kind of obsessed advertising. And if you can connect people with nature at an early stage, that's how we're going to foster the ambassadors for the future who are going to protect the landscape for us.
Absolutely. And I mean, I grew up with an amazing garden as a child, and then kind of lost it when we moved into a house with a very concrete courtyard garden, which it was just, there was nothing there to excite us, so we never went outside. We just stayed inside all summer.
Right.
And then when I discovered gardening at age 21, 22, it was just the most amazing experience. And I think that the children who miss out on it, I'm very sad for. But then when we do get adults and older children who come into the space and kind of experience that for the first time, it's such an amazing experience to be able to give people. And for us, we're hopefully the first step of people going from people who don't engage with nature whatsoever, or maybe do to a very loose extent, to really kind of going on a journey. And it's really interesting to hear from so many families in schools, and like, we live in the countryside, yet most families and parents don't know how to spend time outside. They don't know what to do, and they're like, okay, I could go for a walk, but what am I doing on the walk? And I think that once they've had that experience of really connecting with nature and the sights, the sounds, the scents, and that connection, it's not necessarily, you're not doing anything, you're not playing a game, you're kind of embracing what's around you, as opposed to trying to find something like a phone that's going to keep your attention for 7 seconds at a time.
It's a battle that I'm finding, a lot is, that people quite often say to us, well, it would be really useful to have an app on the phone so that when we walk around Knepp, we can know what we're looking at. We can, we can have QR code on information boards, and I'm thinking, no, this is just a space of nature. We give as much information as we can, as where that we have a walkers car park, and we have an information board there, and we have maps in the shop, and we have information in the cafe and restaurant about the rewilding project. But once you embark on your walk, apart from the signposts, pointing you in the direction of the routes, you're left to your own devices. But I think, not devices. You're left to yourself and not your devices. And I think that is really confusing to a lot of people. We're living in a digital age, and we just are so attached to information that we we haven't been using. It's like not having used muscles. We forget how to use our senses. But that's what we have. We have to switch off that digital mind in order to reach these experiences and reconnect with our senses and our in order to appreciate the life around us. And that can be quite bewildering. And I think for some people it can be quite frightening too. People are very frightened of getting lost. They're very frightened of not knowing or being able to anticipate. But actually, the joy, once you can let go of being on a walk and not knowing what you're going to see around the corner. You could be suddenly confronted with a herd of cows, or a pig with some piglets, or a white stork, kind of flying in over your head. That's when the unexpected becomes the kind of miracle that switches you on.
Absolutely, and it's that kind of losing time. You're so immersed and engaged in what is around you that you're not constantly checking your phone or checking your watch to see how long it's been, which I think is something that we're almost like obsessed with. You're always waiting for the next thing and looking forward to the next event. You're never really present in the moment, whereas I think that there's a lot of spaces outside that really capture you, and you're just in the moment, enjoying exactly what's in front of you, and you're not worried about the stresses of what happened yesterday or the stresses of what's going to happen in the future. You're just kind of there enjoying the moment. And I do think it's a really powerful and magical tool. But like you say, a lot of people have lost that skill and have such fear over letting go.
Yeah, and it is very meditative. I mean, you're right to say being in the moment. That's what it does for you when you start listening to bird song and you start being able to identify different birds, or you're walking with a kind of a sort of casual interest. That's when your kind of brainwaves start to kind of calm down and harmonize and balance. And people say, they start slowing down. Their walk slows down, and you feel rested. And that's it's not just the physical activity that makes you feel better. It's actually what it all does to your brain. There's a wonderful book about to come out called Good Nature, by Professor Kathy Willis from Oxford. And all the stuff that we kind of know, that clean air is good for you, that green spaces fill you with joy and reduce your anxiety and levels and your depression and that kind of thing. She has the science now that proves it all. We know now how sight and smell and touch actually change our neurons, actually change our neurological pathways. They have massive impacts on the physical body. And now we can prove this. This book is going to be really groundbreaking because it's actually going to provide the evidence to encourage, I hope, councils, to get wilder spaces in cities, to get companies to bring green plants like you have in your room into your room. That's actually doing stuff to our own microbiome. There's all this evidence now that we know how, if we bring nature into our lives, and particularly diversity of nature, that has massive impacts on our health, our physical health as well as our mental health.
The book sounds fantastic, and I think that it's really what's needed at this time is that there's a lot of us that are kind of, I guess, preaching that nature's good for you and it's done wonders for our mental health and physical well-being and connection. But I think that quite a lot of the time it takes for things like David Attenborough and his programs and the real hardcore science for people to really listen, because I think until you've experienced it yourself, you don't necessarily believe in it. I was definitely the type of person who was like, yeah, nature, whatever. And then when I had my own experiences in nature, and now I'm kind of 6 years onto that journey, and I just think it's changed every aspect of my life. But for the next wave of people who need to kind of get on board with this, I think it's going to be those types of things that are instrumental.
And we forget about senses like smell. Why do we plant? Why do we love plants in our garden that are particularly, that are scented? And we now have the evidence that actually these scents are doing incredible things to our brains, but also inhaling through our nose is actually helping our immune systems. So all sorts of smells, and you can rate them on a kind of, some particular scents like cedar and lavender and things like that actually have a really profound impact on our physical lives. So, this kind of rather new age idea of kind of our aromatherapy is actually rooted in science. It's not something that's away with the fairies. This is stuff we've kind of known all along, but here it is. It actually works.
That's brilliant. I think we've got so much to think about. I feel like we should have done this right at the start, but I would love if you could give like a brief synopsis for those people who haven't read Wilding or seen the incredible new film, about actually how your project developed over 20 years. I know that it's a lot to cover in a synopsis, but sort of where you started and where you've got to.
Well, I mean, I think as I mentioned earlier on, it's a 3,500 acre intensive arable and dairy farm. We farmed it for about 17 years. We could never make it profitable. And so we're on very, very heavy clay soil. So it's marginal land. It's not really appropriate for intensive modern farming. So in 2000, we turned it over in stages to nature. And we were very influenced by this Dutch ecologist, Frans Vera, who understands how using free roaming animals can actually kickstart natural processes again. So, our ecology would have grown up with huge herds of free roaming aurochs, the ancestor of the cow, or free roaming tarpan, the ancestor of our horse, with reindeer, with elk, with bison, with water buffalo, with boar, with beavers by the millions. And all these animals would have helped shape our landscapes, would have helped create this sort of mosaic of much more open, dynamic, diverse habitats that is rocket fuel for wildlife. So we thought that was really interesting. And if we could use free roaming animals on this space, even if, we've hunted the aurochs and the tarpan to extinction, but we can use their domesticated descendants, cattle and Exmoor ponies in our case, to mimic their disturbances, and Tamworth pigs to stand in for wild boar. We could see if using these animals in allowing them to live out there ostensibly as wild animals all year round could actually improve the habitat, improve the soil, and kickstart biodiversity. And over 20 years, nearly 25 now, we've just seen these absolute miracles happen. It's astonished everybody who's been watching the project from the start, even ecologists. Every year we have people coming doing surveys saying, I can't believe I've never seen so many black caps or lesser whitethroat songbirds before in my life, and I've been ringing for 30 or 40 years, and I've recorded more of those in 2 fields at Knepp than I have in all my life. And people saying you just can't fit more life into this space, and yet every year more life pours in. And as E.O. Wilson, who I mentioned before, says, the more life there is, the more life that comes. And so we're changing the baseline really for, I think, conservationists across Britain and beyond, to understand that actually the carrying capacity of the land is much higher for life than we ever thought before. We should be much more ambitious for our nature reserves and our national parks. They should be carrying much more life than they are now. And if they aren't, why aren't they? And so Knepp has sort of become, by default, we could never have expected this. It was an experiment, and it sort of ran away with itself and has surprised us more than anybody else. But it's sort of become, a sort of example of how nature can pour back in if you let it. We're underneath the Gatwick stacking system. We're in the busiest part of the southeast of England. We're surrounded by A roads. If it can happen here, it can happen anywhere. And I think that's what's become the excitement of the story. We're now embarking on kind of working out how to connect Knepp with other areas of nature, using wildlife corridors. How can we engage farmers and landowners, gardeners, to connect in order to get Knepp to reach the sea eventually 25 miles away. And 25 miles to the northeast, we've got the Ashdown Forest, that wonderful Winnie the Pooh heathland. Again, feeling quite isolated and remote, surrounded by agriculture and development. And they're desperate to connect, because obviously if you just have islands of nature, the species within them are going to, the genetic diversity of those species is going to fall, because unless they can move and meet other populations of their own species, that diversity is going to crash. So it's all about connectivity, allowing populations of wildlife to be able to respond to climate change and rising temperatures. And we've started this really exciting project called Wheeled to Waves. And, it's got an interactive map, so people can go on the map and see if their farm or their orchard or their churchyard or their back garden is on this map, on the routes of these wildlife corridors, and they can register their interest to join the project and then become part of this kind of movement for creating space for nature. So it's really, really exciting. On the first weekend when we launched the interactive map, I think we had 200 gardeners sign up to the Wheel to Waves project, and now we've got many hundreds of gardeners. So they are, if you think as well, I think in terms of not only what you can do in your own garden, but how can you connect with your neighbours? How can you become part of a stepping stone that allows wildlife to hop from one place of nature to another, and eventually perhaps form a corridor where you've got a flow of life moving through you? That's how we can begin to have an exponential effect on that little piece of land that we have control over.
Ultimately, I think the whole thing is all about being more connected with other people, with other projects, with nature, and kind of once again working as one rather than as individuals who each have their own kind of pathway, vision. So I think it's a really exciting time, and it definitely feels like it's the sort of a case study that has blown up across the world, and that is going to really make waves and finally get to see some bigger differences being made across the country. So I'm very excited to see what happens next over the next 25 years.
Well, you must come and see us, and then come and see us again in 25 years.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're almost out of time, but for the people who, I know that everyone who listens to this is going to want to go and read your books and come along to the farm. So where is the best place to find out more information? Because we've covered like 1% maybe of the whole entire story in this hour-long episode, but there is so much more to learn.
Well, if you want to come and visit us, the best place to look is our website, which is www.knepp, that's KNEPP.co.uk, and you can find all about our garden tours, our safaris, how to visit our shop, our authors events and things like that happen here at Knepp. If you want to perhaps learn more about what we're thinking in terms of how to rewild a garden or a smaller space, then the Book of Wildling, I'd recommend. That has a chapter on exactly that. But all the other chapters really feed into that. It's all about how to rewild the mind and think creatively about nature, and how we create space for nature. And then, of course, there is the film, as you mentioned it. It's by the time this podcast comes out, it may no longer be on in cinemas, which is a shame, because it's amazing on the big screen. The wildlife footage is incredible. We had cameramen embedded here during lockdown, and months out there living out of the backs of cars, and the footage they've got of wildlife at Knepp is just absolutely stunning. But that is now available on Amazon Prime and all sorts of streamers. So if you just search for Wilding and the trailer, you'll see where to get it. But that will kind of tell the story, and I hope whet appetites and perhaps spark some interest in how to think slightly differently about gardening and everything else.
I think it absolutely will. I mean, if the book's anything to go by, like I said before, you've got such a beautiful way of telling the story, and it just really, it was a book that I hadn't expected to be a page turner, and I was absolutely hooked. I think I read it as a book and then I listened to it as an audiobook, the second time round because I couldn't get enough.
Oh, wonderful.
Thank you so much for your time today. It's been so wonderful to chat and kind of hear a bit more of the puzzle around the book. So it's been really wonderful, and I know that lots of people are going to be very inspired by what you've shared with us today.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Great to chat to you.